It's a Groundhog Day existence. Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, draws back the curtains on more plaques, shakes more hands, wears out more red carpets each year than any other royal. Day in, day out, she goes through the same relentless routine, and all for the benefit of us.
As far as I'm concerned, she's fairly aloof. She seems to undertake public engagements, but not at the forefront.
She's all right, actually. She's one of the best.
She is a member of the royal family, but she's still gone off and done exactly what she wanted to do. Forceful, does her duty, but no more or less.
Fiery, fearsome, formidable, yes. But as Anne has said herself, I never was and never will be a fairy tale princess. of August 1950. Princess Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise of Edinburgh was the first royal to be born at Clarence House in over 100 years. For the nation, the fairy tale princess had arrived. For Anne, her early years were comfortable, happy, and in the public eye. Her cosy life, however, was to change when she was only 18 months old. Her grandfather, King George VI, died. Her mother became queen.
The Queen felt that she should devote herself to the nation because she was thrust onto the throne at a much earlier age than she expected. And she was so busy being a good queen that she possibly neglected her children.
Princess Anne always had, as I said, a much stronger relationship with her father. So the fact that her mother was now the queen and she was going to see even less of her didn't really make that amount of a difference. In terms of Charles, that did make a difference, because I think Charles was really, as I said, a rather shy and sensitive boy who really needed his mother, and his mother was never there.
With Mummy busy and Daddy away, Charles and Anne were cared for by Nanny Mrs. Lightbody, better known as Nana. Nana described Charles as seriously minded, malleable and good-tempered, but with a great sense of fun. Anne, on the other hand, was much more temperamental, never still, often up to mischief, very intelligent, and not so easily led as Charles.
Princess Anne was never the fairy tale princess that everybody hoped for. Sometimes she looked like it. She had lovely little blonde curls. She did look sweet, but she was a real tomboy at heart and much tougher than her big brother Charles. There was always a sort of clash of personalities there. He's like his mother, rather reserved, and she was definitely like her father, you know, game for anything. She was always trying to outdo him, and frequently she did.
She bossed him around. Anne was always the one who knew her own mind, so because there's not much of an age difference between them, it was really always Anne who was in the driving seat. It was Anne who liked to go riding, it was Anne who went swimming, it was Anne who took part in all these kind of physical activities, and Charles was always the one who had rather be pushed into them.
The young Charles and Anne were educated in the palace by governess Miss Peebles, a strict and shrewd Glaswegian. Miss Peebles adored Charles, ignored Anne.
I don't think Anne has ever really been a woman's woman. I think she gets on much better with determined men who know their own mind. And therefore, the fact that she didn't get on well with the governess, I don't think any governess in the world would have got on with Princess Anne. If you say difficult, I think probably strong person, strong child, knew her own mind, always has done.
When Charles was sent to boarding school, 2 pupils were recruited to keep Anne company. Susan Babington Smith and Caroline Hamilton, both granddaughters of royal courtiers. To give Anne some additional friends, Princess Margaret set up a palace brownie pack. Girls from Holy Trinity in Knightsbridge were press-ganged into joining in the fun and games in the palace grounds.
They were very insulated from the real world in that little schoolroom that they had. She hadn't really mixed with children the way most of us do in the playground with a lot of rough and tumble. She'd been very, very protected, cosseted almost. But times were changing and they began to realise that it wasn't a good idea to educate children at home anymore in the royal family, that they needed experience of the wider world, and so off she went.
Off Anne went to boarding school at 13. The school in the palace was closed. Miss Peebles retired, and Susan and Caroline, Anne's only classmates for nearly 10 years, were told to leave. Anne has had no further contact with them since.
I don't think Anne has really ever been one for leaving too many hostages to fortune. I think the fact that those two little girls have been brought up with her to a certain extent meant that when she passed on to the next stage, they were expendable.
Miss Peebles was just as expendable. In retirement, Miss Peebles lived in a Grace and Favour apartment in Buckingham Palace. She had little contact with her former charges. She died in the palace in 1965, but her body lay undiscovered for several days. Anne attended Benenden School in Kent. She was allowed to bypass the entrance exam. Presumably it was good for business to have a princess at the school. She started on the 20th of September 1963. All 340 staff and pupils lined up to greet their illustrious new pupil. Anne kept them waiting for half an hour as she had been sick in the car, a combination of first-day nerves and car sickness.
In fact, she says she enjoyed it. She really enjoyed the, being able to test herself against other people, especially in competitive stuff like sports. So it wasn't as daunting for her as going off to school to Cheam was for her brother Charles.
Anne settled in quickly. She was, in theory, treated like any other pupil.
It's very difficult, I think, because whenever you're in a situation like that, everyone knows that that one person is rather special. The titles aren't really dropped. There's always that kind of sense of distance. So I think within, again, the inherent difficulties of being educated at a public school with other girls, I think she got on pretty well.
House mistress Cynthia G. said, "Anne never worked especially hard. She wasn't stupid, but economy of effort was her style. With a career in the public eye already mapped out for her, Anne didn't really have to worry about exams or university."
Her mother hadn't gone to university, although it's surprising when you look back on that now, you'd think she would have needed to, but she didn't. And I think Anne was, desperate to get out in the wide world and couldn't have cared less about anything academic.
Anne left in 1968 with 6 O-levels and 2 A-levels, brimming with enthusiasm. And she would need all the energy she could muster. Ahead lay the start of her relentless public duties, a few boyfriends and a wedding.
I think she's probably the most hard-working royal out of all the royals that I've photographed.
She's very neat, very well dressed, looks very quiet.
Her hair's too solid.
She really does do her job extremely well and encourage others.
She works hard, she's got a very good image.
Finally, the princess was invited to drive a snowcat, one type of vehicle the signals operate for shape in Europe.
Strong-willed, opinionated, difficult. I think she soon realised that she wasn't going to play by the rules of the game which some people had laid down for her. She wasn't going to be the fairy tale princess, she was going to be her own person. And if that meant, therefore, that she had to tell the public from time to time to naff off, that's precisely what she was going to do.
As a second choice to the ever-busy Queen, the absent Philip, and the rather aloof Charles, she was a breath of fresh air, and she was available.
We're talking here about the early 1970s. We're talking about the time when the film The Royal Family had been made, and there were attempts to kind of portray the royal family in a more humane fashion. Princess Anne did experience a makeover. The royal photographer Norman Parkinson did his best. And I think always there's curiosity in what the new royal family, the new, as you said, kid on the block, is up to.
On New Year's Day 1970, still only 20 years old, Anne was made president of the Save the Children Fund. Her first major event for the charity, and indeed her first major encounter with the media, was the Blue Peter special assignment to Kenya in 1971.
What is the main purpose of going out to Nairobi?
Well, the main purpose is, in my capacity as president of the Save the Children Fund. I haven't been president very long, and they rather wanted me to see what goes on out there.
We were driving along a deserted track when all at once we saw something move in the grass only a few feet away from our Land Rover.
Hey, you king of the jungle.
She was easy, friendly, not at all standoffish. When we were not working together, you know, she went her own way and stayed in a completely different place and had her own events and parties, but when we were filming together, she mucked in, I think I could say in quotes.
You couldn't ask them how far they've come to Nairobi, or if they've lived in the outskirts.
The Royal Press Corps are used to staying in five-star hotels, travelling first class, having a terrific time, the champagne flows, etc. They were living in tents and travelling in Range Rovers and having a very uncomfortable time, and realised that the princess was too, and they were so appalled that they were having a bad time that they wrote her up as this heroic figure who lived in tents and travelled in Range Rovers over bumpy roads and ate terrible meals out of cooking pots.
When we were relaxed, you know, sort of having a break or something, she would ask me the same questions that every Blue Peter fan used to ask, really, which was, you know, do you look after the cat, and who has the dogs, and do you make all the things that you show on Blue Peter? And it was rather sweet because she suddenly became a Blue Peter fan.
I must say, I much prefer to do this sort of thing. Sit in for hours, perhaps doing needlework or cooking or something like that.
I've never succeeded in making anything wearable in my life.
Back home, with her countless royal appointments, came a closer and often unwelcome relationship with the media.
Anne didn't really have any clashes with the press until she started competing in equestrian events. And then she felt that the cameras especially frightened the horses, and she began to be rather uncooperative, and she backed off a lot from the press. Until then, she was okay. She wasn't exactly wonderfully welcoming when she saw a cameraman or a reporter, but she was okay.
When it comes to the media, Anne is extremely self-indulgent. After all, the press go with the job. You cannot go and open a flower show or launch a ship without the press being there. It's all part of what the royal family does. And indeed, if the press weren't there, there wouldn't be any point in there being a royal family there either.
So on the one hand, she has to accept that they are going to be there. On the other hand, and I entirely sympathise, it can't be much fun wherever you go to have cameras placed in your face and people trying to dog your footsteps. So I think she's always had that, I think, very understandable approach to the media. They've got to be there. On the other hand, she'd rather they weren't there.
Often it was the puerile questions put to her by headline-hungry reporters that touched a nerve. If I've spent the day in a place where children are dying of starvation and disease, they will ask me what I had for breakfast. In the 1970s, when the press corps weren't following Anne all over Africa, they spent much time speculating on who would make her an ideal partner.
She began to get rather prickly and rather difficult when she also started having boyfriends. She believed that her private life was her own business.
In the past, it would have expected that somebody like Anne would have married a royal duke from another royal household, maybe Spain or Greece or wherever. But things were changing, and they realised that actually she was going to marry somebody from this country probably, and so therefore they were looking around for suitable dukes or marquises or earls, but there weren't any of those either.
Numerous aristocrats all tried and failed to match Anne's expectations. One would-be suitor claimed there were a lot of flirtations, but none of us got past the prickles to taste the goodies.
Really, the only people she was interested in were people who were in the horsey world. There was Sandy Harper, there was Richard Meade, there was Andrew Parker Bowles, and Andrew Parker Bowles actually became the love of her life. He was a rumbustious horseman, he was fearless, he would get on his horse and he would fall off and get on again. He was devastatingly good looking in those early days, and he just had a charm and a way about him and was reputed to be the best lover in London. And she was absolutely besotted by him. But the difficulty was that even though the royal family was prepared now for Anne to look at somebody who was a commoner as a future husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, even though he was blue-blooded, was a Roman Catholic, and that was just one step too far.
Well, when Anne first announced she was going to marry Captain Mark Phillips, it was Charles who famously called him Fog because he was thick and wet. And Charles claims that he knew from the start that this was going to be a disaster.
Mark Phillips was an also-ran. He had neither the glamour or the charm of any of these men. Neither did he have the social skills either, and neither did he have the blue blood at all.
I think Princess Anne would never have married someone who could possibly have threatened her dominance. I mean, that was the point. If she couldn't marry royal, and she wasn't, then she damn well wasn't going to marry someone who was too powerful, because again, that goes back to what we were saying about Princess Anne's sort of the contradictory nature of Princess Anne, the princess who doesn't want to be a princess but is not prepared to be a commoner.
For a short while, their relationship developed out of the glare of the media, but the press was on the scent. When Anne was discovered to have been invited to Mark Phillips' parents' farm in Wiltshire in 1973, 2 and 2 was put together. From that moment, the couple had no peace.
There were even, total lies told to the press. For instance, no, we're not getting engaged was the message about her and Mark Phillips, and shortly afterwards they did. And this led to a lot of problems for the Palace Press Office because the media just didn't believe them anymore. They said, you misdirect us totally.
Little was known about Mark Phillips. He had attended Marlborough College, where he failed to shine academically but did well at sports. His career in the army had been unremarkable.
Mark Phillips looked rather a surprise partner for Anne because he seemed to be so quiet, so reserved, so shy. He wasn't exactly the sort of character that we expected that some sort of extroverted woman like Anne, a no-nonsense character like that, would marry.
He was, however, an exceptional equestrian and represented the country at 2 Olympics.
I think the attraction of Mark Phillips was that he was an outstanding horseman. He was very brave, very gifted, and very thoughtful in the equestrian field. And this, of course, occupied most of their thinking time together. And, he was pretty good looking too.
Mark may have been brave, but he was not royal. But this didn't concern Anne. I don't think there was ever a question as far as the family was concerned that one should ever marry anybody in particular. It isn't a duty because I'm not a boy. That side doesn't apply to me.
Up until that time, there'd been a kind of royal rule that you didn't get married or engaged to anybody unless you'd had at least a 2-year romance to test your feelings, make sure you were doing the right thing. Well, Anne didn't wait for that. She didn't want that. She really pressured her parents to allow her to marry Mark Phillips. Within a very short time, they did announce their engagement. And, of course, marry in haste, repent at leisure. That's exactly what happened.
When it came to asking Prince Philip for his daughter's hand, Mark was petrified. Prince Philip was unimpressed by Mark, thinking him dull and one-dimensional. But in fact, Philip had been unimpressed by all of Anne's boyfriends.
Her father famously said she's not interested in anything unless it farts and eats hay. Coming from Philip, that's a compliment, I think. Horses are very important in that family. Horses are important to him, they're important to the Queen.
Anne has always been Philip's favourite. Hers is the only photo of his children on his desk in the palace. Charles's reaction was equally blunt. She couldn't marry a horse, so she's marrying Mark. But there is perhaps more to this than meets the eye.
As every year ticked by, everyone was always saying, when is Prince Charles going to get married? Now that his sister Prince Anne is married, when is it your turn? So there was that kind of slight sense of rivalry. Prince Charles also found Mark Phillips rather dull, because whereas Prince Charles has a wide range of interests, some of them rather shallow and passing, but they are interests, Mark Phillips had really the horses, take that away, there's not a great deal left.
And then the wedding. Despite her rebellious nature, Anne was sucked into the pantomime.
The royal family has always had to adopt a strategy of maintaining its popularity. It has to obtain consent. Once consent is gone, then they're in trouble.
The palace went into overdrive. Before she could say, "I do," her face was festooned on mugs, tea towels and plates. Anne was pictured in pretty dresses, hair beautifully set, makeup perfect. The couple did countless interviews. In reply to whether the marriage could survive in the public eye, she said curtly, "It's got to, hasn't it?" The fairy tale wedding was turning into a nightmare.
I think many brides do things on their wedding day they would never do at any other, or even contemplate doing. So the rigmarole, the coaches, the Westminster Abbey, the bishops, the archbishops and so on, I think that was just a question of putting up with it for one day.
Her Royal Highness the bride with her father, the Duke of Edinburgh, in the glass coach. Only the 10th royal bride to be married in Westminster Abbey, but in so doing, making a royal occasion for all the world to see and enjoy.
If she had lost control of the event itself, Anne dug her feet in over how she looked on the day. Instead of the flamboyant lace and frills, Anne wore a plain, high-necked Tudor-style dress she had designed herself. Anne and Mark also chose the music they would leave the Abbey to. They requested the jolly and fast-paced Radetzky March, a tune more suited to the cavalry than a bride and groom. Prince Philip was reported to have said they were lucky the whole family didn't break into a trot. One of the highlights of the day for Anne and Mark was when they stepped onto the balcony at Buckingham Palace to wave to the crowds. They were overwhelmed by the reaction and spotted a banner which read, "It's never too late to say nay." The couple had a short honeymoon on Britannia away from the press. For Anne, the thought of lying on a beach somewhere soaking up the sun is my version of hell. They returned to the UK to royal duties and to their passion, horses.
The horse riding circuit is also quite an enclosed community, so in some respects she's imitating the royals with the horse people, but she knows the horse people have always been very good, very sensitive about not blabbing to the press.
Horse riding was cathartic for Anne, an opportunity to run free and escape the pressures of being royal.
The certain appeal of horses to her is that horses don't know you're a princess. They treat you like anybody else, and I think she enjoyed that, the fact that she could also prove herself on horseback.
The general sporting public were very surprised that Princess Anne was good enough to become European champion and then go and compete in the Olympic Games. I think her genuine performance and her genuine ability may have come as a surprise, but if you look at her, she was such a steely, determined competitor, and that was why she won things.
The early 70s saw Anne succeed at the highest level. Tragedy struck, though, in 1974, when her favourite horse, Doublet, broke a leg and had to be put down. An event that shattered a usually unemotional Anne. Quite the most ghastly experience of my entire life. Being selected for the British Olympic team in '76, however, was one of the high points.
Well, I think the Olympic team of 1976 really welcomed the fact that Princess Anne was a member of the team. It was fantastic to have watched her qualifying and eventually making the team for the equestrian events. And it was made the British team central to the whole games. There was a lot of attention on the British team. Obviously, everyone was doing their own thing, so there wasn't much time to assemble. But I remember seeing pictures in the newspaper of Princess Anne queuing up in her sports kit, queuing up with the rest of us, waiting for our beans on toast in the canteen. So it was the Great Britain team were privileged to have Princess Anne amongst them. And the fact of the matter is, when you strip everything away, the fact that she's called Princess Anne is one thing, but she was a great athlete in her own right. and she fully deserved her place there.
Inevitably, more papers were sold if they carried a picture of Anne falling rather than winning. At the European Championships in Kiev, photographers captured her fall when she dislocated her shoulder. Anne yelled at them, "I hope you've got your money's worth now." It is perhaps one of the reasons Anne decided to retire from competition at the relatively young age of 26.
I think she gave up competing for several reasons, one of which was the constant scrutiny of the media, and that probably did affect her performance. She was getting older, she wanted a family, she wanted to devote time to that, and also at that particular time she was extremely unpopular. She was known as Princess Sourpuss, and she was always telling people to naff off when they came near her horses, and sometimes she used much stronger language. So she had to do something about that. She had to fight back.
In 1974, Anne had quite a different sort of fight on her hands one spring evening in the Mall. Somebody tried to kidnap her.
Princess Anne's okay. I think she's totally different to the rest of the family.
I think she's a bit of an add-on to the royal family. She doesn't do a lot.
I don't think she tries to mix as much as she should with the ordinary type of people in the country.
Princess Anne, she's really charitable, but she's never in the public eye or anything.
Back in the royal world, Anne would find herself in the headlines for a completely unexpected reason.
In March 1974, I was a personal protection officer when she was attacked in the Mall. It was about between 7:30 and 8 on Wednesday, the 20th of March 1974, when Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips were returning from an event in the City of London. They were driving up the Mall towards Buckingham Palace when a car pulled in front of the royal car and caused the car to stop. It was so quickly in front, the chauffeur didn't have any chance to get past it.
The shabby white Ford Escort was being driven by 26-year-old Ian Ball.
The chap fired a shot which hit me in the shoulder, and another shot which went past my arm. So I took out my gun and tried to fire a shot towards him. It actually hit the edge of the car. I then tried to fire with two hands and my gun jammed. I could see that the man was speaking to Princess Anne and he was pointing a gun towards her.
Ball had planned the kidnap meticulously. He had smuggled guns from Spain and had rented a detached house in Sandhurst where he intended to keep the princess until the ransom had been paid. The ransom note read, "Your daughter has been kidnapped. The following conditions to be fulfilled for her release. A ransom of £3 million is to be paid in £5 notes." Ball also asked for a free pardon for his actions and an aircraft to take him to Zurich. He insisted that his solicitor, Mr. Clark, witness the handover. "If Clark is ill, I want him brought to me on a stretcher. If he is dead, I want his body dug up and brought to the plane." Then this most audacious of crimes fell apart. Ball had not bargained that his target would not do as she was told. Anne simply refused to be kidnapped. 10 minutes after overtaking the royal car on the Mall, Ball was arrested and the event was over.
You can imagine her, as I said, getting on a very high horse indeed when anyone tried to pull a pistol on her way and say, "Excuse me, I'm taking you off now to be kidnapped." I think that's absolutely admirable. She was just damned, she was obstinate, all the kind of things we've been talking about, the traits in her character. She was not prepared to be kidnapped, even though the guns were being waved around.
Princess Anne was very calm and cool, and she talked to the chap, which probably saved her getting taken away or even injured or anything. She was very, very cool, very, very precise, very clear-headed.
He'd made all these preparations, he'd got a safe house, he'd worked out precisely what he was going to do, but I kind of feel that however thorough his preparations, he had bitten off rather more than any normal kidnapper could possibly want to chew.
Ball will remain indefinitely in Rampton Hospital. For him, this may be a blessing in disguise. Author Kitty Kelly claims Prince Philip reacted to the attempted kidnapping by saying, "God help that cretin. If he had succeeded in abducting Anne, she would have given him one hell of a time."
I think everybody took a new look at Anne, a fresh look at her, and thought, my God, what a strong character, how cool she was in a crisis. And certainly it did a lot to help her.
Anne's image was also boosted when she and Mark became parents in 1977. An occupational hazard of marriage was Anne's blunt appraisal of parenthood. Peter Phillips was born on the 15th of November 1977, the first royal baby to be born in a hospital in the 20th century. Zara followed on the 15th of May 1981.
The amazing thing about Anne is, although she seems a very tough cookie, she's a fantastic mother. She has raised two extremely nice, extremely normal children who don't seem to have been handicapped at all by their royal connections.
On Anne's instruction, Peter and Zara were the first royal children for over 500 years not to be given titles.
It seems to me it was a good idea. Anne looked at it through this way. She didn't want them to have to live a life in the spotlight as she had done. She wanted to spare them that, and that seemed one way of keeping them rather normal.
With Princess Anne, on the one hand, you have the fact is that she doesn't have royal titles for her children, so in that respect she's down to earth, common sense. On the other hand, she is very, very sensitive. Even her friends, even her closest intimates, always have to call her Mom, and no one ever calls her Anne.
Like Anne had experienced with her parents, Peter and Zara were to see little of their mother and father. Instead, they were brought up by nanny Pat Moss. Anne was unapologetic. I think that children are quite capable of enjoying themselves without their parents, and they learn to cope on their own. Both, though, have flourished. Peter has represented Scotland at rugby at schoolboy level. Zara has excelled at horse riding and seems to enjoy grabbing the headlines as a royal rebel.
Anne can't help having a title. It's an accident of birth. But a lot of heavy burdens go along with her title. It's sort of noblesse oblige. And I think she wanted to spare her children having to endure that. From the outside, it looks fantastic to be a member of the royal family. It looks a real cushy number. From the inside, it isn't. I mean, from all the years that I've been covering them, all I've learned is that I would never, never change places with a member of the royal family. It's a life sentence.
The state of the marriage had been a preoccupation of the press almost from the day Anne and Mark had wed.
I think that anybody who went to any of the riding events which Anne and Mark Phillips went to could see that Anne never believed in hiding her views from the public. And if she wanted to have a row with Mark Phillips, she wouldn't wait until she was inside the horse box to tell him off for whatever he'd done wrong. She'd do it right there and then. And people used to see them rowing together and just take it for granted. But the chinks in the marriage were pretty visible almost from the word go.
It wasn't a love match. It was a sort of rather charming, friendly marriage of convenience that I think suited both of them reasonably well at the time. And a marriage like that, as the years go by, is bound, I think, to come under pressure, and particularly when one of the members of the partnership is a royal.
Pressure was increased by constant press speculation. Mark Phillips was linked to Pamela Bourdaise, the high society it girl of the time, who claimed that she had stayed in a cottage on the Gatcombe estate while Anne was away. He was linked with broadcaster Angela Rippon, who wrote his biography. A teacher in New Zealand, Heather Tonkin, claimed Mark had fathered a daughter with her. Phillips later paid her £40,000 for equestrian fees.
Either Mark Phillips was having an affair, he wasn't. If he wasn't having an affair, she wasn't prepared to get bothered. If he was, she probably wasn't bothered about that one either. So she was really in a no-lose situation in that respect. Because the marriage, they drifted apart, I think she'd have regarded his personal relationships as his own affair as long as he didn't talk about them in public, which he never has done.
In 1982, the press turned their attentions to Anne. Rumours began about a relationship between Anne and her bodyguard, Peter Cross.
Princess Anne became friendly with some of her royal protection officers, particularly Sergeant Peter Cross. This is bound to happen because probably the royal protection officers spend more time with the royals than their other halves do.
Now, I was told that they were separated in the end by Anne being told that he didn't want to work with her anymore, and the policeman being told that she didn't want him around anymore. And I think it took about 3 months before they both realised that they'd been set up, and this had been a palace way of ending the romance.
Numerous sensational press stories claimed they had petted on the back stairs at Gatcombe, that the code for meeting was, "Would he like a day in the country?" and even that Anne phoned Cross on the night she gave birth to Zara. All this press attention was getting to Anne. When photographer Clive Postlethwaite stumbled upon the princess and her royal detective on a train travelling from Stroud to London, he instinctively started clicking. Anne told him to F off and had him locked up in the guard's van until she had left the train.
She travelled with a group of journalists, even a very small group, and people she knew and had met on previous occasions. She tends to ignore them. Whether this is her way of taking it out on the press for the criticisms they've given her over the years, I don't know. Perhaps it is. Or perhaps it's a royal prerogative that you can pretend you've never met somebody when you have. I don't know. But I didn't think it was terribly polite.
It's the late 80s, and while the marriages of Charles and Diana and Andrew and Fergie disintegrate on the front pages, Anne and Mark simply drift apart. Between 1982 and 88, they did not manage to spend a single wedding anniversary together. It was, however, a spectacular own goal by the palace press machine that finally pushed the marriage over the edge. In April 1989, 4 handwritten intimate love letters addressed to the princess were handed to the Sun newspaper.
Until the love letters between Princess Anne and Timothy Lawrence were handed into a newspaper, there'd been no proof that the marriage to Mark Phillips was really at its end and that this hot romance with another man was going on. There'd been rumours about it, but there'd been no proof. And the fact that the paper didn't publish them, which would have been extremely unethical to do, and handed them back to the princess, was very interesting because then Anne knew that the paper knew what had been going on. It was an open secret from then on.
No one knew who had stolen the letters. Every member of Anne's staff was fingerprinted, but none matched the 6 found on the letters. The Sun was never asked for any money. The whole affair would have remained secret except, believing, wrongly as it transpired, that a Sunday newspaper was going to reveal all, Buckingham Palace went for a preemptive strike and announced at 11 p.m. on the 15th of April 1989 that the author of the letters was the Queen's equerry, Lieutenant Commander Timothy Lawrence.
Divorce?
Very embarrassed.
Never been mentioned by anybody.
This admission signalled the end of the marriage. Mark and Anne separated in August 1989, claiming that no one else was involved. But everyone knew there was someone. The question was, who was Timothy Lawrence?
I have no comment to make on the news at all.
Well, those of us in the media knew Timothy Lawrence because he'd been an equerry to the Queen for some years. So he was pretty much a familiar face, but to the public he was totally unknown.
Commander Lawrence immediately offered his resignation. But quite unexpectedly, the Queen refused.
Well, his resignation at the time wasn't accepted because the Queen was extremely fond of him. He's a very nice man. And she thought, why should he suffer because some, appalling incident has happened that was outside his control?
They realised that he was rather special insofar as the letter, the publication was, an unfortunate accident, but that would be the first and last time they ever had problems from Commander Lawrence.
In his 3 years as equerry, Lawrence made himself indispensable to the Queen and became a favourite. Inevitably, he came into contact with Anne and they became close. While their closeness developed, Anne and Timothy managed to keep things secret. All too fresh in their minds was the controversy surrounding the previous liaison between an equerry and a princess 30 years before, Margaret and Townsend.
It really is a reflection on how the royal family, to be frank, being a member of the royal family buggers up your personal relationships. And Princess Margaret would look back, and that no doubt was an irony that would not have escaped her, because they're exactly Group Captain Townsend, same kind of situation, someone who could be relied upon, good-looking, handsome, knew exactly how to toe the line.
It seemed that she paid the price that was far too high, and nobody thanked her for it. It all seemed that it was unfair, totally unfair, that Anne should benefit when Margaret had only been punished for falling in love.
And then in December 1992, Anne became the first member of the royal family since Henry VIII to remarry after a divorce.
Well, the second marriage in Crathy Church was much more Anne's style. It was like a tidying up of a messy situation. She could now openly live and travel with Timothy Lawrence the way she couldn't before. And I think with just the immediate members of her family there, she was much happier than that ornate ceremony that she'd had at Westminster Abbey.
Conspicuous by their absence were Diana and Fergie. Anne didn't want the silly little girls stealing the show. But Diana wrote to Lawrence wishing him luck in joining the royal family.
At least Timothy Lawrence knew the royal routine. He knew the pecking order, and he was familiar with all this sort of archaic world. And so he slotted in very easily into the family.
Everyone wished the new couple well, even the press. The Daily Mirror reported, "The public approve because they respect her so much and because she has served her country well." In any case, by now, the media was obsessed with another princess, Diana.
She could do more than what she does now. She doesn't do that much.
She seems fairly dutiful. I don't think she'd be particularly missed if she went.
Well, I think it's not only turning up to events like this, but actually having a really good knowledge of the subject. You know, asking the right questions, putting people at their ease.
She wants to be royal when she wants to be royal, but at other times she wants to be just plain Mrs. Phillips or whatever she was.
She was asking where her wand was when she appeared.
While Anne continued her Groundhog Days of royal duties, Another princess was grabbing the headlines, Diana. They had an uneasy relationship.
I think Anne viewed Diana with barely veiled contempt, and she wanted people to know how contemptuous she was of Diana. She felt that Diana had not put in the spade work which Anne had done in her royal duties. She felt that Diana did not have the deep level of commitment which Anne did. In virtually every respect, she felt that Diana was really rather flaky.
Two more contrasting individuals would be difficult to find. Anne, tough, competitive, straightforward. Diana, stunning, unpredictable, manipulative.
I don't think they would have hit it off personally, because the interests of Diana, sort of shopping, fashion, pop groups and so on, are completely beyond the ken of Princess Anne. Never the twain shall meet.
One of the reasons Anne was given the title Princess Royal in 1987 was to distinguish herself from Diana.
I think she was jealous almost in the same way that Charles was jealous of Diana, that Diana was stealing all the limelight. She wasn't a born blood member of the royal family, and yet she'd become a royal by marriage and was now taking all the adulation from every other member of the royal family. By comparison, they all seem so dowdy and old-fashioned, and Anne herself saw that she looked dowdy and old-fashioned by comparison with Diana, and she resented it deeply.
To some extent, Anne must share some of the blame for the mismatch of her brother with Diana. Anne told Charles to get on with it and to think of England while he was dithering about marrying. Charles remarked, "There is nothing more irritating than obtrusive good advice from one's little sister." As Charles' marriage fell apart in the mid-90s, so Anne's popularity rose.
Her stock undoubtedly rose when other members of the royal family besmirched their own reputation. On the other hand, as we know, the media, it's partly about fashion. You know, one year the fashion might be for long hair, the next year it's for short hair. One moment it might be for someone who tells the press to naff off, the next moment it might be for a lovey. And that's precisely what's happened to Princess Anne. I should think she probably sits there from time to time and has this quiet chuckle to herself at the way that sometimes she's up, sometimes she's down.
The rehabilitation of the Princess Royal has been the result of a very well thought out campaign. And I was told that it was mostly her father's doing. It was his good advice. He said to her, apparently, this is what I've heard, keep your head down and work hard and it'll pay off. And that's exactly what happened. And by taking herself off into some of the most deprived areas in the third world, she won a lot of brownie points for that, because few people would want to venture into areas where she went. And I remember once being told by Save the Children that she had been staying in a camp and sleeping on a sort of wire bed, a camp bed, and she'd been sharing a bathroom with 8 other people. You know, sometimes there weren't any facilities to even have a wash. And she put up with all that because she thought it was so worthwhile.
Anne is a self-confessed workaholic. I see no point in sitting around when perhaps I might be able to make a small contribution by doing something.
She's very energetic. She wants to fill her days. If the days aren't filled, you know, she's totally at a loose end. She is a member of the royal family. She knows there is this dedication to duty, and it's something that goes with the job.
And she knows she can make a difference.
I think Princess Anne's been very influential in the recent movement of the Olympic Committee to become much more open-booked and much more able to be scrutinised. She's been pushing for that. She's always been in a good position to do that. She abhorred the bribery that she could see was going on. She abhorred the sort of junketing that was going on in the Olympic movement. She spoke about it a long time before it actually surfaced. And you could always tell by her demeanour that she was uncomfortable in that area where things were moving other than in a normal British type of traditional straight line. So I think she's been a great influence in the world of sport. And I think that comes from her experience in sport, her ability in sport, and the fact that she did compete in the Olympic Games. So thank God she was a member of the 1976 Olympic team.
Charles and Anne have to work together, but they're not close, seeing each other only in the holidays, and roughly speaking, that's enough, Anne has said. One day, they will both inherit the monarchy.
Think of it as the firm. Think of them as co-directors. So in other words, you can have tremendous arguments in the boardroom as long as the press aren't there. But when it comes to presenting a united front, they're all in it together. They bicker, they fight, they just don't get on. They're not really very sympathetic towards each other as human beings, but as fellow royals, that's when the sympathies do come out.
Anne's always had a real belief that she is a core member of the royal family. And if the Queen were to die tomorrow, certainly Anne would have a role by Charles's side in the ceremonial affairs of state. But I think that as the situation developed, I think Charles would very much want to be seen with Camilla by his side and not with Anne. Now there is a huge gap between Anne and her brother. They may stand side by side in ceremonial at the state opening of Parliament or whatever, but eventually Charles wants to rule and rule alone, and I think that he will find his sister an encumbrance.
After the separation and the divorce, of course, it was suggested not merely that Anne should become queen instead of Charles becoming king, which the royals themselves never know was going to happen, but many British people would quite like to happen. But it was also suggested that the solution for Charles's Camilla problem was for Anne to be, as it were, consort when he becomes king.
So when she looks back at her life, I think it would be tinged with some regrets. But by and large, she would say to herself, have I done anything to lower the reputation and prestige of the British royal family? And she could answer that question quite happily to herself, no, I haven't. I've done my best.
But her best may not have been good enough. Anne said recently, I have been a huge disappointment to everyone concerned. I have never been what some people think a princess should be.